Welcome to Off Panel, Sketch.com's creator-centric podcast. This week we have a special guest. It's Nate Simpson from Nonplayer, and thanks so much for joining us, Nate. I really appreciate you coming on. I know it was kind of it was an ordeal getting it together because life is going on, and I happen to have all things going on myself. But I really appreciate you joining.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
So Nate, I really want to talk to you about, Nonplayer. Nonplayer 2 came out last month, and it was, a feast for the eyes, and it was just one of the things I really enjoy about Nonplayer is whenever when I read the issues, I always find myself reading the second or the issue again right after I read the first one. It's just because there's so much depth and detail to drink in when I'm reading it. But one thing I'm really curious about is reading that first issue, and this goes back a while now, but where did Nonplayer come from for you?
Oh, wow.
Going back.
Yeah, we're going way back. What is that? 2010, I guess. Well, actually, it kind of has its roots in another project that was supposed to be my all-time perfect epic thing that I was going to make after art school. And I'd had this idea for this big space opera. It was at one point I wanted it to be a comic. One point I wanted to write a screenplay. Cast of thousands, all sorts of embarrassing things about it. The main character was basically me. So real art school stuff. But it was really all I thought about for maybe a decade after graduating from art school. Mm-hmm. It was always the thing I would sort of kick around concepts for, and I had all the scenes worked out. And finally, I got some time off from work. I actually left my game job at the time to try to turn it into something real, and I worked on it for about 6 months. And it turned out to be complete garbage. And, after 10 years of having this pristine, perfect thing that I had to get done, to finally sort of accept that it was bad and that I didn't have the maneuverability to make it good because I'd thought about it for too long, I had a sort of breakdown, and I experienced complete mental freedom. I was unburdened by this thing, and literally the same day that I accepted that this thing was garbage, Nonplayer sort of dropped in one piece into my head, and it was basically it related to a bunch of stuff that was kind of opposite to the previous project. It was small scale, near future, character focused. It hinged on a lot of stuff I'd been reading about at the time. Ray Kurzweil, stuff about AI and the singularity and all that stuff. And I don't know, it just seemed like it also was sort of a fun justification to draw all the things that I love to draw. Because there are these dual worlds. Right. I can do all the sorcery monster stuff, and then I can also draw giant robots knocking down buildings. So it's going to be a win for everybody.
Well, one thing you mentioned in there is, you did and do now, I believe, work in video games by day, right?
That's correct, yeah.
How much of an influence was that on? I mean, obviously, the game is heavily involved with the whole massively multiplayer online role-playing game world of what is it, the Warrior? Wait, sorry, I'm terrible at the name.
The fine.
Warriors of Jarvath.
Sometimes.
So the Warriors of Jarvath. I mean, how much of an influence was your day job on wanting to tell this story?
I've gotten this question a few times, and I'm not actually sure. Obviously, there are some ways where the relationship is very direct. In the second issue, obviously, there are some characters who are actual game developers, and those are certainly influenced by people I've known. And then, I guess it deals a little bit with the bigger question of how justifiable are games sort of on a moral level, like, is accomplishment in a virtual world somehow equivalent to accomplishment in the real world? Like, is there a difference?
Right.
And obviously, there's probably been a fair number of man hours that I've caused to be sort of wasted or spent non-productively because of games I've made. And is that a bad thing, or am I making people happy? And is that a good thing? And I don't I don't think I really have the answers to those questions, but I think the story sort of comes from a place where I'm asking myself those questions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you were talking about how you get to draw all the the different things that you've always wanted to, because you have like you said, the kind of the fantasy elements of the swords and everything, and then you get the future environment and everything like that. And one thing that just right off the bat, opening non-player 2, and the fact that the inside cover and the first page are just this huge look at the at the world, like this like tower that the CEO of Lands Unlimited is starting this interview. I love that 2-page spread. I just think I love just staring through and finding out all these details. Like there's a random chog from Chew in there, and like just all these like random little details. And I don't know. I mean, one thing I think is really interesting about your work is just like, it seems that you're very meticulous in figuring out, where everything goes and how everything fits and like that. Like, how did that 2-page spread come together for you?
Well, there are a few reasons. I mean, I knew I needed to start it on a big beat
Right.
because it follows a pretty big beat at the end of issue 1, where we've got the sort of reveal of the augmented reality.
Mm-hmm.
The way it overlays the real world, and that's kind of a nice big 2-page spread. And I wanted to kind of start the next issue with a symbol crash to kind of make clear that I wasn't backing off.
Right.
And yeah, I guess because I've sort of decoupled this book from the financial imperative, because there's no way that a book this slow can pay for itself.
Right.
And because I have a day job anyway, in a weird way, it kind of gives me freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It means like this book is already insanely late. At the time I was working on that page, already nobody remembered the first issue. So much time had passed. So it really just came down to like, well, I guess I can make it as cool as I want to make it. And I guess I sort of get off on doing these kind of Richard Scarry, Where's Waldo kind of pages where, it does reward coming back to it after you've read the story. And maybe it even gives everything a little more credibility, because you can tell that even on the more detailed level, there's some thought that goes into it.
Sure. Yeah.
And even if you don't consciously get the references or necessarily find every little Where's Waldo moment, I think subconsciously you kind of take the world a little more seriously, because it kind of feels credible in a way.
Sure.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No. I mean, it totally does, because it's like it's a world of artifacts, and it's just like, you look in there and there's like a Viewmaster, and there's like these random rockets, and like just
Right.
I mean, it's just like filled with all these details, and it's funny because it's like there's almost something for anyone to find to make it feel more real to them. And so like it adds weight to the story just right off the bat, because you're looking at this and you're like, oh man, I know that Viewmaster, I know that
Right.
Chog. And it's like it gives weight to this fictional world.
Sure, yeah, and a lot of the stuff in that image is sort of nostalgia items from my past.
Sure.
I mean, there was a thread on Reddit about it, and it was fun to watch people try to find everything. I think they got through about half of it. Some of the stuff is like kind of inside jokes for me. Some of it was like I had this gigantic spread to fill.
Yeah.
And I don't think I paced myself exactly right. And I had a bunch of ideas of stuff I wanted to put in, which I exhausted in like the lower right eighth of the spread. And I was like, holy crap. And I started asking my friends, like, what would you like to see in there? Like, sort of gave them the setup.
Yeah.
And then and so there's a bunch of stuff in there from friends, and then I ran out of their stuff, and I still was only halfway through. And then I started doing like visual puns based on like band names. Like if you look on the left page, there's like a dude with a radio for a head, that's Radiohead, and then there's a little mouse covering his private parts, and that's a Modest Mouse. And like you can actually, I won't give away any of the others, but there's a bunch of those on the left side. Anyway, yeah, it's a fun game.
Yeah, no, it really is, and it's just, I don't know, it's such a great start to the issue, but not to like completely divert from that, but one thing I'm really curious about is like your creative process, and obviously based on the span of time the second issue took, it may have changed in the process, but when you're starting up a new issue, where do you start, and what is the process you go through?
Well, I write out a script, like an actual, page by page script, like I would if I were handing it off to another artist.
Sure.
And then every step that comes after that is a progressive process of disregarding the script. but I feel like I have to at least I have to have that foundation there.
Yeah.
So then I go through very rough layouts. The whole process is digital. It's all done in Photoshop.
Mm-hmm.
I worked a little bit with another program called Illustudio for the second issue, and I regret that attempt to streamline my pipeline, and I'll be probably going back to Photoshop for the third issue. But yeah, and then it's it's a lot harder to delineate the steps when you're working digitally in the way that you would if you were working in analog, because the sort of passage from rough layout to finished colored art is much more organic. It's just like it's basically the same file, and you're just scooting stuff around until it feels like it's in the right places, and then you sort of drill into the detail.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really have an inking step. It's kind of like, or I guess I would say I don't really have a detailed pencil step. I get the rough shapes kind of marked in where I want things, and then I go right into quote unquote inking.
Right.
Because it's kind of fun to discover the detail and discover the forms, kind of in that final step, instead of having it all nailed down with too much detail. Then it just feels like tracing, and it's kind of boring.
Yeah. As far as like the layouts and everything, I know that's more of a traditional thing where you go through and you kind of pencil out the layouts and everything like that. But do you have a plan for layouts, or is that kind of just a feel thing you're going through as you're developing the issue?
No, I guess I do layouts sort of in the traditional sense. I mean, they're just super, super rough, like just figuring out where the beats are and where the panels go. Mm-hmm. That's actually one of the hardest steps for me. And sometimes I work through that stuff. I have a little Moleskine notebook that, sometimes I'll bust out in a spare moment and, just work on specific page layouts to try to figure it out. Some are harder puzzles than others.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, a lot of artists I've spoken to have kind of described it as the problem-solving phase.
Really, you're playing Tetris, basically. It's kind of drives me crazy, and the only person I know who has perfected it is Mike Mignola. Everybody else is kind of trying to do it as well as he does. Yeah. Oh well.
Yeah, well, I think he's got a lot of practice on that whole thing, and yeah, I mean, I'm a huge Mignola fan, but I mean, I do really like the way you tell stories, because it seems like there's a really good flow to the stories. It seems like, reading an issue of that, everything flows together so well, both, in the story, but also I like how it kind of transitions in and out of the, fictional worlds we are dealing with. Like, you really saw that in the first issue. The second issue had that some too, but I don't know. I mean, I guess for me as a reader, it just reads very smoothly. Huh.
Well, that's really great to hear. I've heard the opposite, actually.
Really?
The second issue covers a lot of there's a lot of exposition. There's a lot of expository ground I have to cover to kind of get all the pieces onto the board.
Sure.
And the first issue's, like, yay, fun, cute girl riding a cat and using a sword, and that's all like, yay, I can sign up for that. And then the second issue, you meet a lot of new characters, and a lot more time is spent in a less pleasant environment.
Right.
And there are a lot of scene shifts that rely very heavily on like radical color shifts in order to like make clear that I'm moving from setting to setting.
Mm-hmm.
And getting that stuff to be legible and getting it to flow was pretty challenging. And some people feel like I may not have been completely successful in that pursuit.
Well, yeah. You can't please everyone, Nate. You can't please everybody. But
my life is an ongoing experiment to see if I can make everyone like me. Although I did finally, after 4 years of being at odds with the internet, I finally blocked a person on Twitter. So
congratulations.
I feel like that was an important rite of passage for me.
I've never done it. I'm still waiting for my first, but I feel like it's just around the corner for me.
It's quite liberating when you realize, I can turn a person off and not have to deal with them anymore, and it's wonderful.
I've always heard the mute button feels pretty good too, but
yeah.
I actually just wrote an article or published an article today about social media and creating comics in the social media era. And it's just, it's really tough because like, even if you are like somebody who treats people really well, and even if you are somebody who, behaves appropriately and everything like that, still people, it's staggering when you look through like, let's say a famous person's like replies on Twitter. I mean, like I would lose my mind if I was getting those messages. I can't even imagine.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember, who was it? Was it Joss Whedon who finally quit Twitter after having like a bunch of death threats or whatever? And that, apparently that's par for the course. Yeah, I'm experiencing the extremely lightweight version of that. I basically have one really like motivated hater, and for a while it was sort of a white whale for me. I mean, like for a couple of weeks, I was like, he was trashing me pretty hard in a conversation with someone else, not even addressing me. But of course, this is something everyone should know. All creators will search the name of the thing they made on Twitter to see what's being said about it. So even if you don't like, do at Nate Son of Simp on Twitter, like if you write anything about Nonplayer, it's like saying Beetlejuice 3 times. I will appear.
You are the Candyman.
Exactly, I'm the Candyman. And and this guy was slagging my book, and I was like, oh, just out of curiosity, what's your problem with it? And he just, he got mad. Boy, did I shake a bee's nest on that one. So, some people just, I guess not everyone will like you. That's just how it works.
Well, and I have to ask, and I know this is probably a subject you've been asked about 50 billion times, and it's your favorite, but when the second issue came out, like, while I understand we're living in a time where comics really are made for everybody. There's something for everybody. There's much more niche than there ever was before. It's kind of like, I don't know, like Napster era music, where you can really find anything for comics for yourself everywhere, especially when you bring into webcomics. But Nonplayer, like, at the worst, I guess you could say that they're like, what those people were saying about transitions or something, but it's hard to really say that the craft was poor or anything like that. But I was seeing some, reviews that weren't, it seemed like people were really focusing on the delay. So for you, I guess, could you explain to listeners on the show what exactly contributed to that delay, I guess?
Sure. Sure. Well, real life happened. There was never, so this book was kind of, when I started working on it, it was going to be self-published. It was something I was doing on my own timetable. And really the only rule, well, there were a couple rules, but one of the biggest rules was I was going to work on every page until I couldn't think of a way to make it better.
Right.
Which is already, right out of the gate, the DNA for this book is completely opposite from all comics that are made to make money.
It's churn. Make it fast.
Yeah. Well, and I understand if you've got to pay your bills with a comic, you cannot make it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, of course, people who were born to make comics and born to make them fast, and I really do envy them, and I wish I could make comics at this level of quality quickly. But that hasn't been the case. Maybe issue 3 will go faster. I don't know. But that was in the DNA of the book from the very beginning. And then I was, I was contacted by Image essentially, and it went from being a thing I was kind of just doing and that I was going to somehow print somehow in China or something, to being like a quote unquote real comic book.
Right.
And I felt that pressure ever since to there's a part of me that still feels like I'm failing because I'm not going fast. And I think only very recently have I come to accept that the healthiest way for me to make this book the way that it needs to be made is for me to focus on the long term.
Sure.
And that, in the same way that I think a lot of my critics focused on the delay and had the question wasn't, is this a good comic? The question was it worth the wait? Mm-hmm. I mean, literally, that's the title of like half of the review. Was it worth the wait?
Yeah.
Some people say yes and some people say no. To my mind, that is not actually the question.
Right.
The question in my mind is this a worthy chapter in what will be a 7-chapter book at some point in the future?
Mm-hmm.
So I have to remind myself, and I have to pace myself, because I am still at the very beginning of a very long marathon.
Right.
And sometimes I get demoralized, and I don't think there's anyone in the world who would like to see the end of this project more than I would, because I would like to maybe make another thing before I'm too old to hold a stylus. But this is the thing that I've started, and this is the thing that has, gotten me attention and brought me all sorts of really wonderful life experiences.
Right.
Yes, I completely understand why people would be frustrated having to wait between these issues, especially if they're accustomed to, a professional, cadence.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the kind of book it is, and it couldn't be as at the level of quality that it's at and come out faster.
Right.
Which is kind of how it works. And I'm, as I mentioned to you, I think before we even started recording, I have a day job. This book has been made completely. The second issue, at least, was made, in the early mornings. I was getting up between 3:30 and 4:30 every morning to put in a couple hours of work every day before going to work. And so, my commitment to the project, I think, has been proven. But yeah, go slow when you've only got an hour or two a day to work on a thing, and you have a brand new baby.
Yeah, as you said, life happens, and like I was having I'm going through a process of buying a house right now, and I also launched my site just last month, and I was going through this process. Or I was going through the thought process earlier. I was just like, why did I do both of these things at the same time? And it's just like, sometimes you just can't predict things. And it's like, for me, I think one of the interesting things is like, there's a lot of conversation these days, especially on social media and everything, about, comic artists and like kind of, the quality of life a lot of artists deal with, and like the super long hours and the very little free time a lot of them get, because like you said, like a lot of comics are based off of immediacy. There's a lot of churn going on, and they have to keep working to keep that monthly schedule going. And right. I've spoken to artists who are very candidly saying, like, when I'm putting out a comic every month, I'm putting out not nearly the best work I could do.
Right.
And to me, like, it's kind of interesting, because you have like people are like, oh, I want the best comics I can, but then you have the other end of the spectrum where you're putting out the best work you can, and it's kind of, it results in an elongated schedule. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there's room in the world for both of those things, to me.
Well, it's I mean, they're both hard lives. I haven't played a video game in a couple of years. Mm-hmm. I just read a book. I gave myself the luxury after finishing issue 2. I took the time to read a book.
I'm very happy for you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it was an amazing luxury, and sacrifices get made if you're doing it either way. My ideal setup would be, and this is, I think, the thing that keeps a lot of people going, regardless of whether they want to be honest about it. At least, especially a lot of the Image comics, because they're creator owned, and nominally the IP ownership lies with the creator. So there's always that outside chance that Hollywood will come calling, or something will click and you'll be the next Walking Dead, or whatever that is. And that's really kind of the Deus Ex Machina. That's the thing that could kind of maybe make it pay for itself.
Right.
Because I do have this fantasy that I would get to work on Nonplayer all day, every day. And then, of course, the turnaround time would come way, way down. It wouldn't be a fast comic by any means, but it would happen, once a year maybe, right? Which is better than once every 4 years, which is my current cadence.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, so are you familiar with Saga and Fiona Staples?
Yes.
Yeah, so I heard... I think it was on Twitter, and I saw somebody from Image talking about the fact that, like, that book comes out pretty much every month, and then they take like a break for a trade paperback to come out, and then I think there's another month gap, and then the next issue comes out. So it's like 2 or 3 months. And
hardcore.
And I read somebody from Image saying something that where they regularly get questions as to whether or not they could get like a fill-in artist so they could get Saga more often. And I'm just like, when I see something like that, it's just it just kind of speaks to sometimes like the how artists have a tendency of being devalued to a certain degree, because it's like that book is equally Fiona's as it is Brian K. Vaughan's. And it wouldn't be the same without her. And, not to go off on a tangent, I just thought that was fascinating.
Especially in her case, I absolutely agree with you. And I hadn't heard that they get that question. That's super lame.
It really is.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, people look at it like like it's a product, and it is a product. And I guess different people want different things from comics. I like the idea that there is at least the possibility of the existence of a different kind of comic from a big two comic. So
sure. Well, and I think one of the interesting things, and like maybe this is a direction the comic's going to evolve in eventually, but I feel like to a certain degree with like the way that the creator-owned movement's going, and like it seems like a lot of comic shops themselves are shifting more towards, like, sales are shifting more towards trade paperback and graphic novel sales. I have to wonder if the format's going to start to shift, and maybe that could lead towards books like yours, instead of being a single issue floppy or something like that, turning into a graphic novel eventually or something. But that's
certainly the long-term plan for Nonplayer. I mean, that's where it'll, I think, finally get noticed, actually, is when it's got an ISBN number and you can just buy it on Amazon or whatever. Yeah, I don't know, but that's going to be a while from now. I've heard some people say, well, why didn't you just do it as a trade paperback to start with? And I think people underestimate how difficult it is to, I mean, I don't know, at this rate, that might be like a decade of work without any sort of feedback or any kind of, I don't know, you need a little bit of that public feedback in order for it to feel like it's worth it. Otherwise, you really are just toiling in the dark like a monk.
And having a different approach isn't going to make you have more free time to work on it.
Right. Yeah, that doesn't really change anything. Someone who's doing something interesting and different is Jake Wyatt. I don't know if you've gone to the Jake Wyatt Riot Tumblr.
Oh, Necropolis. He was actually part of the social article that I did today. I really like Jake.
He's the coolest ever. I met him at Heroes Con. He's a really super likable guy and immensely talented. But also what he's doing with Necropolis is kind of interesting, where he is kind of bypassing floppy entirely. He's just releasing it as a webcomic, and then Image is going to collect it in trade paperback form, which is, it's going to be interesting to see how that works. Because that is one way. Now, that would actually, I think, probably hurt me if I attempted it that way, because what I've discovered over the years is that I owe almost all success I've enjoyed specifically and directly to comic shop owners. Because if a motivated shop owner, like somebody who really believes in the book, can get so many people to look at it. Like, I've had single shops that have probably sold thousands of copies. And that's, that really adds up when you think about my total sales only being, kind of, I don't know, that first printing, I think, only sold 5,000 or 6,000 copies. That means there were individual shops that were responsible for very large percentages of my total sales. So having those people in my corner has made a huge difference for me, but maybe not so much for Jake. He seems to be a lot more internet savvy.
Oh yeah, like that was one of the things that we talked about a lot, was just like how so many of his jobs came from the internet. But I do think that it is, what you're talking about is like retailers. Fans don't think about this, but retailers really are the customer, and like they're the ones who are going to be your evangelist for your work, and they're the ones who you have to impress to order them, or to get orders and everything. So like if you put out quality work, you're gonna get big orders, and you're also gonna get support. And I don't know, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting about your work is it seems like regardless of the span of time it's taken, it's like it seems like the people who do read it and enjoy it really, really, really enjoy it. Because this is going to sound ridiculous, but I actually genuinely remember where I was when I read the first issue.
Wow.
Well, we had so I used to write for Multiversity Comics.
Oh, okay.
And Matt Milikov, who was the editor-in-chief there at the time, he had gotten an advance from you, and I was on a world trip, and I was in New Zealand, and I had just gotten the PDF onto my iPad when I was in, going from this really small part of New Zealand to another really small part of New Zealand. And so, there wasn't a lot to do on that bus. So I think I must have read that issue like 3 or 4 times in a row. And I was like, this is different. This is different comics for me. And it really left an impact. And also,
wow.
Not that I'm saying that it was because it was boring, but it was also a very boring bus ride. But anyways, have you ever heard about the way that Pixar makes films?
I've seen a couple documentaries on the subject. What specifically?
Well, I've heard, and this is something Andrew Stanton said, and he said, and this maybe isn't what they do always, but he said that they make a movie twice, basically, and that it's like maybe just through the process for storyboarding or something like that, but they do it once, and then they kind of tear it down, and then they do it again to make sure that they get all the story beats right. But one thing that I'm curious about with Nonplayer is, are you pretty meticulous about the way that you're, like you said, you're pretty free flowing when you work, and sometimes you just tear down the script and just build it up again as you're working on it.
Yeah.
How meticulous are you on putting together a single page? Are you do you constantly fidget with it? Or are you messing with details, or how do you work?
On every possible scale, I'm a fidgeter. That's why, the digital approach has been a huge boon to me, and I probably would never have attempted real comics if I hadn't had it. But at the same time, it's complete. I can just noodle a page probably until I literally physically die. Well, just to give you an example of one of the more radical revisions, for the second issue, I drew. So in the script, it starts with an interview between, this woman and the guy who runs the company that runs this game. And in the original version of the interview, I had focused more on what was being said and less on what one was seeing as it was being said.
Sure.
And I drew maybe the first 5 or 6 pages completely, not colored, but I had all the line work done. And the entire thing was 2 people sitting in chairs talking. And I don't know how I got so far down that road before I realized, you ended that first issue on this, augmented reality moment, and there's all this cool stuff that happens, and then is this really how you're going to say hello to people after this inevitable delay? It's like, chairs. By the way, Nonplayer 2 is people in chairs.
I have to say, the 5-page preview for that probably would not have been the most exciting issue I'd ever seen.
It sure would not have been. I guess that I did it the Pixar way, because I had the whole thing laid out, and I had the first 5 pages really nailed down tight, and I had to throw them out. And then once I figured out, I can show and not tell a lot of these concepts in that opening sequence. And I'm very happy with what we ended up doing. But also what I discovered was I was trying to save time by forcing myself to stay inside the 25-page limit. And I had all of this stuff that happened in the second issue, and I had it laid out so that it was just a hustle. I just sprinted through this story. I mean, these scene changes, every one of them was a cymbal crash, and there were no one-page spreads even in the original version. It was just those setting shots, like the fish market shot was just a panel at the top of the fish market page, and then it was right into robots throwing fish, and you're like, what's happening? It's just so fast.
Yeah.
And again, I kind of just had to twist my perception of it a little bit, and I realized, I've actually got 30 pages to play with, and why don't I just let this expand to fill the entire thing, including the insides of the covers. Which is, I think, kind of rare, actually, to have content on the inside of the back cover.
It's actually growing increasingly more common on image books, but still, it's you're talking about 3 or 4 books that are doing it.
Well, yeah, I think I mentioned in an interview that I had allowed the length of the comic to go from 25 to 30 pages. And I'm glad I made that choice. Looking back now, every one of those splash pages really lets you catch your breath a little bit, because there's so many setting changes. But Eric Stevenson, the publisher at Image, was not not excited about that. I got an angry email about it. Like, he's like, "Come on, this is taking a long time already, and now you're talking about adding 5 pages to it." And I was like, I don't know what to say, man. Like, this is how it has to be. So, yeah, I guess short version of all that is, yes, there have been radical overhauls of things all the way through the process.
Well, and I do think one of the interesting things is, like, you were talking about how, this really is a passion project for you. Like, you're not telling it for the sales aspect. You're telling it because it's a story you want to tell. And, it seems like you're accepting in the fact that what that is fluid, and that, as you're working on it, it's evolving. Even, you probably have a good idea as to where it's going, but it seems to me that, like, that could change by the end of it.
Well, anything's possible. I actually I have everything written out for the full 7 issues.
Like script.
Not at the script level, more on the beat level.
Sure.
And the second issue did not really change very much in terms of its content.
Just approach.
Just the sort of pacing and context are things that I have a lot of trouble visualizing abstractly, and I only really come to grips with them when I'm sort of wrangling the lines on the page.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that kind of stuff requires a little bit of sweat and tears for me. But, like, the things that actually occur, what happens in each scene and what order the scenes occur, didn't really change at all. So,
yeah. I actually forgot to mention, like, my favorite part in the 2-page spread at the open was the Castle in the Sky robot in the bottom left corner.
Nice.
I missed that. Like, I'm a big Studio Ghibli fan, or however you pronounce that exactly. But anyways, I noticed that, and I thought that was awesome. But
on that subject, the reason, the actual proximate cause for my quitting my job originally to make my big special project was my wife giving me a collection of storyboards for Nausicaa.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that was literally like that moment of holy, like, I don't know if you've seen any of those collections that just is like all of the storyboards for the movie in sequence.
I haven't seen that. I actually just got the manga, like the whole series in a collection, and as soon as I have time to read all of that, I'm very excited about it. But I've not seen the storyboards.
Well, the interesting thing about the storyboards is they're pretty much shot for shot how the movie ended up. And it was very inspiring to think that movie really is pretty much just all from this one guy's head.
Yeah.
He really is an auteur. Mm-hmm. And if you have world building ambitions, that's very inspiring to see that you can accomplish that much. I love Studio Ghibli as much as you do, or Ghibli, or however you say it.
Did you see the documentary that came out last year, The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness?
I didn't. Does it get into his relationship with his son at all?
No, not at all. No.
That's the most depressing thing about his life for me, is that his son has tried so hard to emulate him and impress him, and he's been so openly critical.
Oh, wait. No, it did. Actually, it didn't really get into the relationship. It really it was interesting because it seemed like it deliberately positioned them separate, which sounds like they are.
Yeah.
But no, it was during the making of the Wind Rises, and it was really fascinating watching that, because he said that there wasn't a script. Like, he just did it all on storyboards, and then it was like, I'll write it later. And I was just like, whoa. Like, how do you do that? I'm like, you're talking about a feature-length movie, and it was just like, the amazing thing is just like, in his mind, he knew, like, it wasn't just like the story beats, he knew the details down to like colors of dresses and stuff. And some of the stuff would shift, and like he would flex with it, but I mean, for the most part, like, it was like he had this entire vision. And if I understand the story correctly, The Wind Rises wasn't even a story he originally wanted to tell, and he was just kind of talked into it by his producer.
Wow.
So I don't know. I mean, he's a very inspiring man, but yeah, the son thing is kind of a bummer.
Well, he's kind of Mozart, isn't he? He should draw at a billiard table.
Yeah,
while bouncing the ball around.
He seemed like a guy who was very enthusiastic about making movies, exercising like in odd ways, and smoking. So he definitely seemed like like an auteur in the truest sense.
Well,
Well, one thing I think is really interesting about Nonplayer is like, I mean, it's your first full comic project, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So a lot of this really is like you kind of figuring out the whole thing for yourself.
Yeah, right. It's been a process of learning how to draw a comic. I mean, that was sort of the title of my blog at the time was, learning how to draw a comic by drawing a comic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and uh, I think I've been pretty transparent about like the lessons I've learned on my blog.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's pretty comical actually how many things I've gotten wrong. Basically, if a thing can be done wrong, I will find a way to do it wrong at least once. So I don't know. I'm learning the lessons the hard way.
What is that saying? Like something about like for every time you do something wrong, it's just one step closer to being the right way.
I
So
guess so. It's like evolution. It's biological style evolution where I try everything and only the stuff that doesn't suck makes it through.
yeah. You have a strainer for all the stuff that you don't actually want to be in your comic. You just
Right,
have you have to
exactly.
go through it first.
That's why it's time consuming. Millions of years.
Um, one thing I wanted to talk about is, and you mentioned this earlier for transitioning the scenes. I really like the coloring you do in the book, and I like that the settings all have different kind of color schemes to a certain degree. Like when the whole fish scene with like the controllers for like the mech. I don't know exactly what the names of those mechs were, but like that transitions into red and then has a bit more naturalistic setting. And then, like when they go to the cube, that it's all green, and that naturally that's probably part of the cube's design and everything. But the entire room is such, and it seems like you're. I don't know. I guess I'm curious about your coloring style. Are you more of a straightforward, realistic type of guy, or are you a mood guy?
Definitely a mood guy. I mean, especially that those red scenes and the green scene really were 99% motivated by the need to transition from a scene where it's a bunch of people in a room with rectangular walls to another bunch of people in a different room with rectangular walls. It was like all the NAIB agents are talking to Cube, and then we have another scene where there's Jeff Homer firing Alan,
Right.
and when it was just line work, it was not at all clear that you were in two different places. So I kind of just hit you over the head with a color bat.
All right.
And it would be interesting to find out if colorblind people have a radically different experience of the book, because I do rely heavily on color to validate those transitions. And the reason why is because I have a rule about there's no omniscient narrator, and there are no thought bubbles. So basically, I'm going by movie rules. Like it's just like the scene has changed only because what you see changes.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, there are functional reasons for those color choices in those cases. Otherwise, I think it's more of just an aesthetic thing. I definitely have a weakness for French style color and pastel color, and I don't know that I know very much about color. So I'll generally kind of just start laying on colors almost at random, and then through a highly iterative process begin to kind of feel my way towards something that feels right. And if you use Photoshop at all, there's a thing you can do to kind of bully your colors into being in the same key, which is to kind of choose like a big orange color and just put it on a fill layer on top of everything,
right,
or any color really, but let's say orange, and then set that layer to an overlay blend mode, and it just kind of kicks everything into the same key. And it's usually like super saturated and gross looking, but it can kind of give you some ideas, and then you can lay in more color on top of that. And I usually end up with a Photoshop file that's got like between 150 and 200 layers.
Oh my God.
Just that's like, yeah, again, it's because so much time spent on it, and because I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm just sort of feeling my way toward something that I like. Kind of works that way.
Well, my wife works in Photoshop from time to time, and I actually kind of like I work in an advertising agency by day, and I see people working in programs like that, and I pretty much assume that they're wizards. Like I don't know how you even, like, I try to work with graphics software and it's just a complete just disaster. So working with, that many layers, that's just unbelievable. But I have to, for somebody who is a self-described fidgeter with your art, I have to imagine, like, I've always heard artists talk about using digital and having like an undo function and things like that is just such an incredible time saver.
It's not a time saver at all. It absolutely makes things go 1,000 times slower in my case.
Oh, really?
But, but yeah, and not only that, it gives me horrible drawing habits. Like I was just at Heroes Con, and everybody wants a sketch, and I just refuse to do commissioned sketches because I know they're going to be terrible. But I will do like what I call doodles, which is basically like I get to sketch without the pressure of having to be good.
Right.
And I don't charge anybody any money. So if they want me to make marks on a page, I'll do it. And they're just so, like, I'm so dependent. I even feel like my left hand is hovering over a phantom control V the whole time, because I have a very, like, just the gesture itself of the line. I'm used to drawing it 2 or 3 times and just automatically undoing between each time until it just drops in the way I want it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it in my case, it has not been a time saver at all. And it would probably do me a good bit of good to buy a physical sketchbook and start honing my draftsmanship again.
Well, I guess I hadn't thought of that, because I was like, oh yeah, that seems like it would probably, help people a lot. But I guess for, if you're the type who's going to be adjusting the story a lot and trying to, get details to the exact spot you want it to be, I guess the undo button would be kind of almost your enemy in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my nemesis.
I think it's funny that you had the whole phantom control V thing, because it's like, my friend has a 7-year-old son, and when he talks about reading now, he'll like do a swiping motion for like an iPad instead of like turning pages, and it's it's like this funny little thing. But I think it's funny how, like, technology has kind of changed the way that we approach little things like that. Like you're used to having that hand over there, so you're probably just like, wait, I don't have that for a sketchpad. That isn't, but you have to like kind of train your brain to think differently.
Oh, right. And I mean, I spend 8 hours a day doing it as a job as well. So yeah, it's totally ingrained deep in my brain at this point.
Oh, absolutely. Well, one other thing I wanted to talk about was, I think the whole AI angle is very fascinating. And you said that kind of originated from stuff that you had been reading. I guess, like, where did where did that aspect of the story come from? Like, you said it came from a book, but I guess I'm curious as to like what your interest is in AI and the development of that side or potential technology.
Sure. So there was the Werner Vinge books that I read kind of just before I started working on the comic, and he wrote this really interesting book called Fire Upon the Deep that has a pretty awesome AI villain in it that is depicted. I think it comes the closest that I've seen so far to describing how unfathomable and godlike the powers of a true superhuman intelligence would be. Mm-hmm. And essentially, it's magic-like. It is godlike, and we are sort of knocking at the door of that in our reality. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what Nick Bostrom talks about in Superintelligence. Of course, Elon Musk has been talking about it more and more in the popular media, and it's definitely a thing that people are beginning to worry about, and I think with good cause. Mm-hmm. What I actually tried to do in Nonplayer is show 2 different kinds of artificial intelligence. One is these game characters who are coming to life inside the game. Mm-hmm. And those would be kind of human equivalent AIs, or AIs that are designed to replicate the way a human mind functions.
Sure.
In reality, we're sort of pursuing two approaches to artificial intelligence right now. One is replicating the human brain, which is just like studying the brain at the finest level of detail and trying to replicate it in a digital matrix. Mm-hmm. And that in itself will result in a kind of intelligence that is superior to ours only because of how fast it will run on digital hardware. Mm-hmm. So just a normal human with normal human capacities running in a digital matrix will be thousands of times faster and therefore, in a lot of ways, superior to us right out of the gate. And that's the potential. That's the potential that these sort of game characters embody. But then there's this whole other thing, which is, developing all these kind of loosely interrelated but extremely robust forms of artificial intelligence that are designed to do things that humans don't do.
Mm-hmm.
And then the possibility that there may be certain self-organizing properties or self-improving properties that these AI components have that could result in something that where there's this explosion, or what they call a takeoff event, where it continues to write its own successor AIs, and that process accelerates exponentially. And over the course of minutes, we go from I think the illustration that Nick Bostrom chooses is a paperclip, an AI that's designed to run a paperclip factory, and in a matter of days or weeks, it turns the entire Earth into a giant pile of paperclips because it's basically pursuing this goal very single-mindedly, and will even use strategies and tactics like subterfuge or misdirection to protect itself from any sort of human intervention if it believes its ultimate goal is to
make paperclips,
make as many paperclips as efficiently as it can. It could interpret that mandate in a way that is not friendly to the existence of life on Earth. So we have to be, I don't know. That's really exciting. And I have a character like that, which I have only really kind of hinted at its capacities, mm-hmm. which is Cube. Mm-hmm. Which is it's basically the only legal super intelligent AI in the world of Nonplayer, and it's used essentially by the cops to catch other illegal AIs.
Right.
So this, it's basically a god in a box, and there's this very elaborate sort of series of barriers that have been put in place around it to prevent it from leaking out into the real world in any way. Essentially, it has a huge number of inputs, so it can watch the entire internet, but its only output is a phonographic audio output that is listened to by 3 humans, all of whom have to repeat and verify what they've heard from it. They repeat those words to the people on the outside. That's the only way that this thing has any contact with the outside world in an output fashion.
Yeah, I was actually really curious about them because when I was reading the book, that was one thing I didn't exactly understand, if they were, an aspect of it, or if they were just people who were interpreting what Cube was spitting out effectively. But
right, yeah, especially because of like precogs, and I've heard a lot of people say that it kind of feels like Minority Report.
Yeah.
Just I think because I chose 3 people. Well,
yeah.
I mean, who knows? Maybe subconsciously that was informed by.
If you chose 7, nobody would have ever guessed.
Exactly. Right, but what's happening is they just have headphones and they're just hearing the computer's voice, mm-hmm. And then they are repeating it verbally to listeners on the outside. And so the lady in the center is repeating what she hears, and then the other 2 people say verbatim, which just says, "Yep, that's what I heard too," mm-hmm. just to make sure that the machine has not in some way perverted or subverted or cajoled or blackmailed or whatever its way into getting one person to say, or say or do things that are unapproved. This is as transparent a means as they have of making sure this thing doesn't get into trouble.
Yeah. I think that's super fascinating, and I mean, it seems like there's a lot of different directions it could go, especially with the the non-player character elements that are now spilling out into the real world. But right. I think that one of the characters that was most interesting in the second issue was Hanley, and just the fact that he just kind of rejects technology to a degree, even though he works for NAIB. I mean, like he doesn't have an ear hook. He doesn't have he doesn't have the exact trust of Cube. Like, he doesn't look at Cube as this infallible being of sorts like everybody else seems to. And yep. I don't know. I mean, is Hanley kind of a character who represents kind of the paranoia of technology to a degree?
Sure, he's the Luddite.
Yeah.
And he's also,
He's
there's
also a
something really
badass.
appealing. Exactly. There's something really appealing about the sort of old school G-man. Like he's even got the old school haircut. He's physically old as well.
Yeah.
But I was just really, I enjoy the contrast between him and Agent Lee, who's his sort of sidekick, and their relationship develops over the course of the 7 issues. And there are reasons why Hanley feels the way he does about the technology.
Sure.
And then also it has certain benefits. I mean, he ends up really kind of being the only effective person in the fish market scene because he's not over reliant on this technology that can be kind of subverted or messed around with.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of the ultimate watchdog and the kind of ultimate bullshit test for everything that happens at the NAIB.
Mm-hmm.
And he annoys everybody because he makes everything go slower and really it would be great. It's like if you meet somebody who just refuses to use a cell phone, you're just like, oh, they're like, you have to call me on my home phone between the hours of 5 and 6. I don't even know this person I'm describing. This person doesn't exist in my experience. But if they did, it would be super annoying. So Hanley's kind of that.
I do think it is funny because like I actually know people who still have like, I don't know, flip phones and like just like random things like that, and it's just like, not that I don't have a problem with that, but at the same time it is kind of funny because it seems like it's like they're making a conscientious choice to stay away from that, but they still want the ability to call and text. They just like, oh, I can't be controlled by my phone. One of my favorite parts, like a random part in the issue, was when Lee is it Lee? When he asks Hanley if he wants a spare ear hook, and like this is storytelling. It's one of those typical awesome comic moments. But I just love the fact that instead of saying anything, you just had this badass Hanley just say nothing, and Lee's like, "Good enough."
And there is this, of course, this sort of developing paternal relationship between the two of them, just because of the age difference. But I love those sorts of moments where Hanley is very no nonsense and very very direct about what he wants.
Yeah,
I like that kind of character.
Well, he also doesn't get hit by fish, which is a huge advantage for an NAIB agent.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun when I figured out how that scene was going to play out. I definitely, the thing I wanted to draw most when I started issue 2 was the Waldo with the swordfish through its head. So.
Yeah,
it was fun.
I think it like that scene wouldn't have been nearly as effective if it was like a rogue robot with an AI inside of it, where like it's got a gun and it's got a gun to the person's head. You're just like, the fact it's throwing fish makes it much more entertaining.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not screwing around. Like once you've seen a fish thrown through a robot, you realize, oh yeah, no, this is dangerous.
Yeah, especially if it's a swordfish. That just that's deadly for anybody.
Sure.
Well, Nate, I think that's actually all I got for you. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me, and I love your work, and I appreciate you chatting with me about this.
Oh, thank you. I hope I didn't talk your ear off.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel from Sketched.com. You can find our guest, Nate Simpson, on Twitter at Nate, Son of Simp, and his blog at projectwaldo.blogspot.com. Follow Sketched on Twitter at Sketched Comic, and visit our site at Sketched, that's SKTCHD.com, and join us next week for another episode.